Alright, so let's continue talking about the human impact upon the marine ecosystem. In the last lecture, we were talking about the different ways that humans impact the marine ecosystem, destruction of the system, habitat alteration through things like trawling or urban coastal development, but then also we started talking about pollution, human introduction of substances that reduce the quality of the environment. That's on us. That's definitely all on us. And we were looking at the sources. So we talked about fertilizer with eutrophication, and then we started talking about sewage pollution. Again, anything flushed down a toilet potentially will make its way to the ocean. The things that do not biodegrade. So again, we talked in the last lecture about things like birth control, or different chemicals or medicines and things that we use for healthcare, and then they go through our body, they get flushed out of the body through our body process of urination, and goes into the toilet, goes to a treatment plant. A lot of times that just gets pushed into the water system and eventually makes its way into the ocean. So the problem is these things accumulate and accumulate and continue to accumulate over time. Another source of pollution that we want to talk about is oil pollution. Now this becomes a huge issue. The frustrating thing is we rarely hear about it. It's just once in a while when you get this big spill. But the problem with oil pollution is there's always oil being released into the marine environment. And the oil can accumulate, or organisms can accumulate the components of oil, and a lot of those components are toxic. So this leads to some significant problems. Generally we hear about it when, there's been a big oil leak or an oil spill, and that makes headlines in the news for a while, and then people forget about it. But the oil, a lot of it is still there. Now it will naturally biodegrade, but that takes time, and depending upon the amount of oil in the environment, it may take significant amounts of time for that oil to eventually dissipate and be broken down and degraded. So major sources of oil pollution, when we look at where does this stuff come from. There are natural seeps. We are not going to control this. We're not going to do anything about it. There's nothing we can do. But natural seeps are by far the largest production, the largest percentage of oil that makes its way into the marine environment. Okay, so again, we can't stop that. But what we don't want to do is contribute in other ways to pollution, to oil in the marine environments. Second most common form of oil pollution, and this is in North America, land-based pollution and recreational boating. So here's number 2. So number 1, natural. Number 2, what we do on land. Or, I'm going to go out to the lake, I'm going to go out and go boating, I got my jet ski, and firing up those engines, and that stuff leaves oil. You get that little oily film in the water. Okay, that's going to be there. Recreational boating and then land-based pollution that washes into the marine ecosystem. Transportation of oil. This is where we get those boats or pipelines or tankers or whatever it may be that you got an accident. Exxon Valdez ran aground, rips open the hull of the ship, millions of gallons of oil come spilling out. Pipelines, transcontinental pipelines break and they're leaking, and that oil works its way into the aquatic system and eventually flushes to the ocean. That's our third source. Fourth major source, or fourth source, is the extraction process, or the actual just exploration for more oil. So you get these oil rigs that are trying to draw oil out, and there's a blowout. Accident, failure of the equipment, whatever the case may be, and now you have oil going into the aquatic system directly into the marine environment. So again, the challenge here is oil can be broken down. There are bacteria and microorganisms that can break it down, But when we put too much into the environment, they don't have time. They don't have the opportunity to break it down because there's just too much there for them. And then all the different marine organisms that are exposed to it suffer significant consequences. So when we look at pollution and pollutants in various types and forms, we see a thing called biomagnification occurring. Okay, this is a big, big concern. So biomagnification is when you have an increase in the concentration of your pollutant as you go up the food chain. So at the bottom of the food chain, your phytoplankton, there's just a tiny little bit of pollution. And each organism has just a little bit, as they measure it here, 0.1 parts per million, ppm. Well, then the zooplankton, the next trophic level, eats the phytoplankton, and that pollution goes up. So the zooplankton are eating hundreds of phytoplankton. So as you eat hundreds of the phytoplankton, you accumulate the concentration of pollution. Now you get the fish that sit one level above that eat the zooplankton, and now they eat hundreds of zooplankton, which ate hundreds of phytoplankton, which now increases the concentration of the pollutant. Let's keep moving up the food chain. As you move up, or we could call it the trophic levels, your pollution continues to accumulate. That's the problem. It accumulates. It builds up. It builds up. It builds up. So marine organisms that sit high on the food chain, top level predators, the ones that live a long time, take years and years and years to mature and develop before we then harvest them, actually are the most polluted or toxic organisms in the marine ecosystem. So there are concerns about tuna. Tuna sit very high in the food chain. Sharks, seals, sea lions, all these animals contain high levels of pesticides. We can find mercury in the body tissue of polar bears. You know for darn sure polar bears are not out there eating mercury, but they're eating seals, and the seals were eating the fish, and the fish were eating the plankton-feeding fish, which ate the zooplankton, which ate the phytoplankton. And that's why we have mercury content in polar bears, when they've never, ever touched a thermometer to pick up mercury or any direct contact with it. It's through biomagnification. So that's a major concern. So when you guys are thinking about which seafood am I going to eat, think about that. Oh, I want that nice big tuna steak or swordfish. Odds are it's got some kind of pollutant in it because of the biomagnification issue. All right, so there are sadly other toxic substances out there. PCBs, heavy metals, we already mentioned mercury, but lead, cadmium, copper, all these things are problems. All these things are in the marine environment, and they're accumulating, and they're not going away. That's the worst part, and the scariest part is that this stuff is not going away. There's a thing called global distillation. The concentration of PCBs and heavy metals in polar regions is accumulating. Okay? Now the polar regions, the environment of the polar regions, we don't have a lot of circulation, there's not a lot of currents moving through there, it's colder, so things tend to sit. They're concentrating. They're concentrating PCBs and these heavy metals. It's just continuing to accumulate. And again, think about where the polar bear's at, and the seals and the sea lions and those animals. They're in those polar regions. So that global distillation is a problem because we see these pollutants concentrating in different regions of the marine ecosystem. So, okay, now there are, sadly, other pollutants in the marine environment. So there's a whole list here we're going to talk about. So, solid waste. the number one solid waste in the ocean? Plastic. A thing called microplastics. Okay, these things are found everywhere. So plastic doesn't biodegrade. It doesn't break down and become a completely different substance. It simply gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. It keeps getting smaller. It's still plastic. It's everywhere. It's all over our planet because of the amount of plastic we use and dispose of improperly. We don't recycle as much as we should, and that stuff just is found everywhere. So sadly, you go swimming, snorkeling in the ocean, and you take a net, a very fine net, and grab a bunch of that water and filter it out, seine it out, and collect all the tiny little particles, you're going to find plastic there. Think about the picture of Glover's Atoll, that beach. How much plastic was sitting on that beach? It doesn't go away. It's going to be there. All right, another form of pollution is thermal pollution. This is coming from power plants. So as power plants generate power, they produce heat, they produce temperature, they discharge hot water. That is what's giving us thermal pollution. While you may think, oh, that's not a bad thing, well, if they're discharging heated water out of a vent pipe, that changes the water temperature, and we know zooxanthellae don't like that, and the corals die because of it. So sometimes we get thermal pollution as a problem. Saline brines. This is coming from desalination of salt water. So different countries, different parts of the U.S. were taking salt water, removing the salt to create fresh water, because we need fresh water for people. And what that leaves behind is this super, super, super concentrated saline salt solution that then usually gets discharged back into the ocean. So it's kind of like the thermal pollution issue. You got this big pipe from the desalination factory pumping the water back into the ocean, and is just extremely salty. A lot saltier than what is naturally found in the ocean. And where it discharges can completely change that particular environment or ecosystem. And then the radioactive waste. This is coming from nuclear power plants. When we see nuclear wastes being discharged or nuclear power plants near aquatic systems, it can lead to problems there. So the challenge here is all of these issues, from habitat destruction to dredging or trawling to oil to pollutants to etc., is pressuring the entire marine ecosystem. The ocean is stressed and feeling pressure from human activities, and that is causing species to become threatened or endangered, and then sadly extinction. So what we'll look at in the next set of lectures, or the next lecture, last one here, is the threatened endangered species status of the marine ecosystem. So what do we know, what's current, what are the projections, but then lastly we want to leave with what can we individually do, just on a very small scale, that does have a benefit, that will make a difference and possibly help out.